This gear stick surround from a Mercedes 107 has seen better days. The varnish, lacquer is all faded. This is what it used to look like. And there were bits missing down here, so we've started the process of taking off all of the old lacquer and the old veneer. And we're going to re-veneer this. We're actually going to re-veneer it in Zebrana because that's what the rest of the car is. This must have come off a walnut burr car. So we're going to have a go at veneering that and seeing if we can get that curve in there. On the reverse side of this here, this is where on this particular car it's a manual, so the vinyl gaiter clips around here. On the reverse side it's actually glued down, so I'm going to use a very thin blade and see if I can get underneath there. Important to try not to crack this bit of plastic, as it's prohibitively expensive to get a new piece, even if you can get a new piece without cracking it. I'm just using 2 watchmaker's screwdrivers and just very carefully putting it underneath and then moving around 1 millimeter at a time like that, just to carefully pry it up, not so much as to crack the plastic, just enough to get the screwdrivers in and just gently pry that up, tiny bit at a time. And that seems to be working. And then as I'm going, I'm just wedging this up. I happen to have some of these long blades here, so I'm just wedging that in like that all the way around with the 2 watchmaker screwdrivers. This should, in theory, just pop out. It might just be. There we go. Okay, we didn't take too much of the wood off, tiny little bit. We're just going to clean that up, clean off all the old glue, and then just make a note of which way around that came out. As you're taking the old lacquer off, or the old veneer, is the lacquer comes off relatively easy when it's faded like that, but as soon as you get to a darker patch where it's hasn't been faded by the sun, that is really stuck down solid. And when you take that off, you generally find that the veneer and the underlying veneer comes off as well. In this particular case it doesn't matter because we're changing the veneer to Zebrana anyway, but it's just worth mentioning that if you were just repairing a small patch, that the faded lacquer will come off easy, but you'll find it very difficult to get that off without, if you're using a chisel. Maybe it's easier if you sand it off, but you're likely to chip the veneer off when you try and get the darker bits out. Okay, having sanded off all the old cracked lacquer and the walnut burr on this center console piece, we are going to attempt to re-veneer it using Zebrana, which is this stripy wood, which is what the rest of the car is in. So we've ordered a sheet of Zebrana. It's about £13-14 from eBay. That's arrived. I've just stuck that onto a piece of wood, which we're going to use for testing. That is the Zebrana with just varnish on it, or lacquer on it. So you can see that this is the colour we're trying to match. Obviously that's walnut, but the colour of the walnut and the Zebrana is about the same. You can see that that is substantially lighter, so we're going to have to dye this. So I've got 3 little dyes here from Little Fryers. They've just arrived. These are tester pots, and we're going to test each one of them to see if it comes anywhere close to what we need. We've got English oak, dark walnut and French oak. So first of all, I'm going to mask off some areas here so we can see the areas next to each other. Once we've decided on the stain to use, we've got to decide where to join the veneer, because the width of the veneer is only about that wide. So we've got a choice to join it across there, join it across one of these lines. I don't really know the best way to do it. I might talk to some woodworkers and see if they've got any advice. And the other thing that we need to do is decide whether to stick the veneer on first and then cut out the templates, which is nice and easy on here, but it's going to be very difficult on here because that's a kind of routed edge there. So I don't quite know what we're going to do. Maybe what we'll do is stick the veneer on, or make a paper template first. We stick the veneer on, stick the paper template on that, and then cut around the paper template. I think to actually, the advantage of cutting the veneer first is if you muck it up, you can redo it again. Whereas if you stick it on there first, if you muck it up, it's very difficult to recover from it. Anyway, we'll have to work that one out. We've put 2 coats English oak, 2 coats French oak, 2 coats walnut, And then one coat walnut, one coat, and we're just going to put some lacquer on there now, leave it overnight. Then we're going to match it up with the Zebrana trim in the car and see how it comes out. So once you put the lacquer on this, it will go darker, like so. Just mixed up a tiny bit of lacquer with hardener. Just going to put one coat on. Obviously when you put it on the actual car, you do it with a bigger brush and not get all these brush strokes in, but this will just give us an idea of what the colour's going to come out like. I'm thinking the walnut is going to give us the best finish, but until you actually put the lacquer on, let it dry, harden, you're not really going to be able to see. So ideally when you're brushing on lacquer, you want to just have a much wider brush and do this in one brush strokes like this, so you're not overlapping and getting brush strokes. But this is just a very rough, give us a very rough idea. When we come to do this for real, we'll be using 2 or 3 coats of lacquer and sanding down between the coats to give us an ultra smooth finish, and then buffing it with a special buffing compound. So we're just using this stuff here, which they use for flooring and bars and stuff. It gives you a very tough, shiny sheen. So I don't know if you can see that, if it comes out on camera, but already you can see that that's darkening. So we'll let that harden overnight and then we'll compare it with the car tomorrow. Okay, this is our sheet of veneer, Zebrana veneer. We've got plenty of it, so we're basically going to cut once here, one slice here, leaving plenty of overlap, and then we're going to do the same again because we're going to have to join this somewhere. And I'm thinking that maybe I'll join it along here, or maybe along these line of switches. But first of all, we're going to just cut 2 widths off. I have forgot lots of this because even using a very sharp Stanley knife, it's still quite easy to break it. But in this particular case, that's not going to matter because we're going to overlap it anyway. Okay, we've applied glue on that side. We've actually chosen to use Evo Stick Impact. I had really good results with this when I was doing the tests before. I was going to use this stuff here, Tight Bond Original, which is what everyone recommends, but I've gone against what everyone recommends. Put a glue on the back of there, applied it as evenly as I can using a paintbrush. I'm just going to stick the 2 sides together, and then I'm going to paint glue on the other side and join it. The other piece, sorry, and join it. I think sometimes you have to do things to learn how not to do them. So I've basically put contact adhesive on both the back of the veneer and the front of the center console. And the trouble with contact adhesive is you don't have the chance to make any adjustments, and therefore joining the 2 bits of veneer together is fraught with danger because you only get one shot at it basically. And when I put that piece of veneer on, I didn't put the stripes exactly square. I don't know if it will actually ever show. So I think if I was doing the job again, I probably wouldn't use contact adhesive if I had to join 2 bits, or if I had to try and line them up in a specific way. I think using contact adhesive is absolutely fine on a little test thing like this, where you're just sticking something on a block and it works really, really well. But if you have to try and line things up, you need to use something that gives you a tiny bit of leeway, and that's probably why everybody recommends using something like Tight Bond. But you live and learn. So I'm going to leave that set overnight. Meanwhile, I'm going to go down to the car and see which, if any of these, actually matches the colour of the Zebrana in the car. We're down at the garage now and just trying to match which of these is the closest. I would say all of the ones with just 1 coat on are just too light, and probably, as suspected, the closest is the walnut, possibly the French oak with 2 coats on. I'm going to hold this out in the sunlight as well. What do you think? Top one, that one, or that one? Just tricky, they're both quite close. Just really not a lot in it. Tricky to get an exact match, but I would say it's the walnut is about the closest to that. Okay, we've glued the veneer on overnight. Now we've got the tricky task of trimming it. We've used a contact adhesive, which has its pros and definitely has its cons. So the next thing we're going to do is just use a sharp knife and try and trim the edges here without splitting the veneer. To trim the edges without splitting the wood, we're just going to go over with a bit of 400 grit sandpaper here, just to get any rough edges off what we've just cut, and then we're going to start on the difficult task of actually cutting out the switch. I'm going to start with the easiest of the cuts and the biggest one as well. Just try and cut that out without splintering the veneer. And then I'm going to use my template over here, put on the other side and see if I can cut the switches out. Bits that need a bit more cutting, like this corner here. You don't want to force this out to run the risk of splintering stuff. So just that corner there needs a little bit more cutting. If all has gone to plan, that piece should just come out without too much splintering. These little rough edges here we're just going to have to sand back, but other than that, it seems to have gone quite well. There with some 400 grit sandpaper. Once again, don't worry if there's a few tiny little imperfections, because on this particular piece we will be gluing in the plastic gate, and that will cover any of the edges around here. So now we're going to move on to the really difficult parts, and we can't really simply just turn these upside down and cut them, because there are these little notches here, and that side, the underside of that, is actually wider than that square. So we're going to try and use our template that we cut before we put the veneer on, and see if we can use that to draw around the switches, or use that to cut them out. Stanley knife, and borrowing a pair of your wife's high magnification glasses so you can really see what you're doing in there, which has got a sort of inset routed edge. I'm just going to clamp my template on. See that it's actually moved slightly already, so I'm going to clamp the template on, then draw around it, and then cut around my lines that I've drawn around the template, and I'm just going to try and cut that out. That's the electric mirror switch in. It's not absolutely perfect, but you'd have to be looking very closely to see that. So next up is just, we're going to stain the wood, and then we're going to lacquer it, and then we're going to install it. That's the first coat on. Actually did 2 coats, and it looks like this tester pot is going to be enough for 2 coats, which is great because it brings the whole cost of this thing down to under £20. Okay, we've let the stain set overnight, 2 coats of dark walnut, and we've just put on 1 rough coat of the Rustin's plastic coating, and we don't really have the right size brush. We've only got a small brush like that, which is too small, or a big brush which is too big to get in the gap, so we're actually going to get a smaller paintbrush. So the next stage is to let that dry, sand it down smooth, then give it another coating with the right sized brush. About 3 coats of lacquer on here. We've just sanded it with some 400 grit. You can see where it's darker are the low points, and where it's matte are the high points. So we're hoping to progressively get rid of those low points. Ideally, when we sand it, we want the whole thing to be matte, which means it's one flat surface, but it's proven very difficult to do that with the Zebrana, but we'll give it another coat and see how that goes. For the lacquer to harden, and then I've just sanded it off with 800 grit, and now I'm just doing the last stage, which is polishing it with this burnish cream, which is basically a very, very fine abrasive. I'm just applying it with the abrasive side of a green sponge to start off with, and then polishing it off with a soft polishing cloth. And it's not going to come out like a mirror finish, which is fine, because what I'm actually trying to match is the ashtray, and that is a pretty close match. So we've finished sanding and lacquering the central console, and I've just come down to the garage to put it in the car to have a look and see how it matches up. I haven't clicked the switches in yet because they're quite difficult to get out, or glued the plastic trim in there, but I'm not 100% sure I'm happy with that. Actually, it might be a case that because I've done it myself I can see every imperfection, but the problem I had was I never really managed to get a completely smooth flat finish on this piece of wood, and I think it's because it never started off smooth, because the Zebrana itself was quite wavy. So maybe what I should have done is sanded down the veneer first to make sure that was flat before I applied the dye to it. However, it's certainly a million times better than it was, but it's not 100%. I'm not quite sure whether I'm going to leave it like that. I think I may just get the boss to have a quick look at it, that being my wife, because she's normally the first person to say, oh, that's not right, you've got to change that. But the rest of the car is coming together. Really happy with the paint job that we did on all of this dash. If you remember, before it was all scuffed, etc. Just still waiting for a cog to come in for the speedometer, and also while that was out I noticed that the clutch master cylinder was leaking, so I've whipped that out. We're just waiting for a replacement. I decided in the end that it just wasn't good enough. I had sanded down too far and some of these white lines were showing through, so I'm going to sand the whole lot off, start again. I'm just using 80 grit sandpaper to get back down to the Zebrana, take off all the old dye and all the old lacquer and start again. Off all the old lacquer as best I can, and these dark patches is where I haven't quite managed to sand it all off. If you sand too far you'll be back down to the wood, but I'm hoping that's not going to show too much, and we're going to start again. And basically we used just one tiny lid full of this tester pot. We've actually changed the colour. I'm going to try doing this with French oak, which is a slightly redder colour than the dark walnut which we had on before. When I put the dark walnut on the car next to the other Zebrana, it did look slightly too dark, so I'm going to do this one with French oak. Okay, that's the third coat of lacquer I've put on. This time I have not made the mistake that I made last time of sanding it too heavily and going back down to the wood. I'm just using 1500 grit sandpaper just to take off the tops and any brush strokes, etc. So I think that's going to come out really nicely this time. Obviously I haven't got the Zebrana ashtray here, just a walnut one, but I can see that that is already looking a lot better than my last attempt. So tomorrow we're just going to buff that and put it in the car and see how it looks. Gator back in, just remembering that the little nick out the top there is at the top, and we're just going to reinstall it in the car. Switch is plugged in, but just before we tighten everything down we're just going to turn the ignition on and make sure all the switches still work. The switches, this panel's held in with just 2 Phillips screws here, remembering that there is a little plastic plug that fits into a hole at this end. So let's tighten those screws down next, and then the ashtray goes in. Plug the ashtray in, and remember that it goes in at an angle like that. Just squeezes around the corner. Once you've got that in, 2 screws at the back. As you can see that, 2 screws at the back hold that in. Ashtray goes in, just pulls forward, and then I should just slip straight in. And last but not least, the gator clips over here. That's it, that's the woodwork done in the car. The central console was re-veneered in Zebrana, and we replaced these parts here which weren't correct. That was in walnut and that was in vinyl, so everything's matching now. It's not quite perfect, the central console, but you'd have to look quite hard to see the defects, and we have saved ourselves hundreds of pounds. Once again, if money was no object, you could get along to the SL shop or Germany or somewhere like that and buy a complete set of wood for about £850. £850. So we've saved ourselves a bit of money doing it ourselves. Next up, we're going to put the instrument panel back in. We're still waiting for one cog to fix the mileometer, and also the clutch cylinder under there, which will hopefully come this week some stage. We can reinstall that as it was leaking. And then that just leaves us the tricky job of trying to trim around these corners without too many creases, and then waiting for the seats, and that's about it.